My family banned me from Dad's birthday. Then his business partner went silent seeing me. I never thought I'd be banned from my own father's birthday, let alone receive the warning in bold letters from someone who used to call me sister like it meant something. Do not come to Dad's 65th. You've embarrassed this family enough. Don't make it worse. That was the message Max sent, short and sharp like a knife, and Max always knew how to twist it too. My name is Celeste Barber. I'm 31 years old living in Seattle, and for the past 7 years I've worked mostly in silence tucked behind layers of NDAs and internal servers. People in the AI industry might know the name Project Juniper, or the nickname The Ghost in the Code, but they don't know the face behind it. That was intentional. After walking away from the family company, from everything my last name used to buy me, I figured disappearing was the only way to survive. I didn't just disappear. I built something. Something no one saw coming. But we'll get there. I was born into the kind of family that throws formal dinners when board members come to town and takes Christmas photos in matching suits. My father, Victor Barber, founded BarberTech in the 1982nd. What started as a humble electrical engineering firm grew into one of the West Coast's leading legacy tech corporations, focused on infrastructure automation and public systems. It was a safe company, old money kind of safe. Reliable, stiff, boring. I was never meant to belong there. But that didn't stop my father from grooming me for the corner office since I was 15. When I was still in high school, I'd get dragged into client meetings and told to listen quietly. In college, he gave me two options: double major in electrical engineering and business, or rethink my place in the family. I did both. By the time I was 24, I had a desk with a title but no authority, and a schedule packed with meetings where my only job was to smile, take notes, and stay invisible. That would have been tolerable if not for Gwen, my father's second wife, who made it a mission to remind me I wasn't strategic enough for leadership. Her son Max walked in 2 years after me with zero credentials and a perfect set of veneers, and was given a VP title after his second quarter. When I tried to raise concerns about the predictive software models we were beta testing, models I'd designed and prototyped during my MIT lab fellowship, Max called them neat ideas and redirected the project toward a less innovative, more market-friendly spin. 3 months later, the version he pushed got a feature on Forbes Tech. His name was on it. Mine wasn't mentioned. I was told to take one for the team. The final straw wasn't even loud. It came in the form of a politely worded email blind copied to 3 board members, informing me that while we value your contribution, my division was being merged into Max's for strategic alignment. My badge still worked for a week, but nobody looked me in the eye. The assistant who used to bring me green tea every morning forgot my name. Gwen didn't even say goodbye. My father. He left me a single voicemail that said, "You're young, Celeste. This is a pivot, not a rejection. Let Max learn. There will be other chances." That was the last time we spoke. I left BarberTech quietly without a press release or lawsuit because I didn't want to fight. I wanted a clean slate, a silent lab, a place where the code did what it was told, and the people didn't stab you after reading it. I took the remaining patents I'd filed under my own name, rented an abandoned robotics facility in Redmond, and started over with 2 people who still believed in me. We ate ramen for 6 months and coded until our eyes blurred, but by the second year we had our prototype. A neural mesh AI interface that adapted emotional response patterns based on real-time stimuli. In simple terms, we'd figured out how to make machines not only think, but empathize. No one in my family knew I was still in tech. They thought I'd run away to paint or teach yoga. I let them think that. I changed my email, deleted every trace of my LinkedIn, and signed contracts under C-Lin. When our Series A round closed with Sinclair Holdings as lead investor, I used the proceeds to buy out the robotics patents my father had shelved 5 years ago, the same ones he once called too far ahead of their time. And then just a week ago I got the invitation. Victor Barber was turning 65. The event would be at the Rosebridge Pavilion, black tie, by invitation only, with local press expected to cover the Legacy Awards ceremony. Gwen had designed the whole night. Max would be giving the keynote speech. I wasn't even listed on the family tree in the event program, but Henry Sinclair had other plans. "You should come," he told me, voice calm but curious. They've been begging for a meeting with Juniper Systems for months, and they don't know you're the one they've been emailing. I stared at the RSVP card on my desk, traced the gold leaf embossing with my thumb. I didn't want revenge. I wanted recognition. But sometimes they come wrapped in the same box. Especially when you've been banned from your father's birthday. And especially when his most powerful business partner goes silent the moment he sees you. There's a moment in every exile where the silence starts to feel like safety. For me, it came during the third month, living above the Redmond facility surrounded by cold concrete and humming machines, when I realized no one from my old life had tried to call. Not once. No messages from Dad. No awkward apologies from Gwen. Nothing from Max except a short note asking if I'd left behind my ergonomic chair. They erased me faster than a bad quarterly report. And yet, even as I told myself it was better this way, part of me still replayed the moment it all fractured. Not the final day when I packed my things, but 2 years before that when I saw clearly what I meant to them. I was 26, standing outside the main conference room at BarberTech, holding a polished presentation on behavioral modeling in neural networks. My proposal had taken 6 months. It was scalable, ethical, and adaptive, designed to power intelligent city grids across the West Coast. The meeting was supposed to be my pitch to the board. Instead, I was pulled aside 10 minutes before it began. Gwen smiled with that professional warmth of hers and told me gently that the agenda had changed. Max would be leading instead. He'd be presenting something a little more market-ready, something simpler to grasp for the press. I wasn't even invited to stay in the room. My hands shook as I watched Max flip through a rebranded version of my proposal, stripped down, diluted, packaged in bold fonts. He had changed just enough to call it his own. Dad sat beside him, nodding along. Not once did he mention me. That was the day I understood it wasn't about merit. It never had been. BarberTech had always been built on legacy, and I was only ever a placeholder until Max looked convincing enough to inherit it. My father didn't hate me, but he didn't see me either. That's worse in some ways. Invisible loyalty. I tried to speak up once during a quarterly review when a journalist miscredited Max for an automation prototype I'd worked on for 18 months. I brought the internal logs, timestamps, early sketches. Dad looked at them, sighed, and said, "This isn't a good look, Celeste. It makes you seem petty." That word stayed with me longer than the betrayal. Petty. As if asking for basic acknowledgement meant I didn't understand the bigger picture. As if success only counted when someone else decided I deserved it. I didn't speak up again after that. I spent most of the next year coding in isolation, slowly transferring my files to external storage. Every night I walked past the BarberTech slogan carved into the marble lobby wall, innovating with integrity. I started to wonder if they even remembered what integrity looked like. When I finally left, I didn't slam the door. I just closed it quietly behind me. A few people in the company noticed I was gone, but the rest assumed I'd gone off, to find myself, or burn out. That's the version Gwen liked to repeat at fundraisers. She needed time. Burnout's real in young talent. No one questioned it. People like Gwen had a way of saying things that sounded factual even when they were fiction. And the deeper truth was I didn't leave because I was weak. I left because staying had become a slow kind of self-erasure. My voice was being rewritten. My name replaced. I wasn't going to fight to stay in a room where my presence was considered inconvenient. The world didn't need another woman playing secretary to her own ideas. It needed something different, so I left to build it. The early days at Juniper were raw, unglamorous, and cold. Eli, my co-founder, was one of the few people who didn't flinch when I told him how broken I felt. He'd been through his own share of boardroom knives and shallow partnerships, so he understood. We didn't talk much about feelings, though. We talked about code. About building systems that could understand tone, stress, emotional variance. We believed machines could learn empathy faster than the people funding them. And we were right. But it took years to prove. There were nights when I thought I'd made a terrible mistake. Nights when grants fell through and prototypes failed in front of potential investors and the heater in the warehouse went out during winter. I remember crying once quietly in the server room, only to wipe my face and go back to debugging because the AI kept misunderstanding sarcasm. I kept going because I had nothing to return to. And because somewhere deep down I wanted to create something that couldn't be ignored. It wasn't revenge. At least not at first. I wasn't trying to destroy anything. I just wanted to prove I'd been real, that my ideas had value, that I wasn't just some shadow behind Max's stage light. That's the part people never understand about building in silence. It's not about hiding, it's about protecting something fragile until it's strong enough to stand on its own. We called it Project Juniper because junipers survive fire. They grow stronger after the burn, and so did we. By the end of year 5, we had a functioning prototype that made a venture partner cry during a demo. Not because it was impressive, but because the AI pause detected his hesitation and asked if he wanted to continue. No script, just presence, something real. That was the moment we knew we had something bigger than a product. We had presence, we had future, we had leverage. And as it turns out, when the future knocks on the front door of the past, it doesn't always knock gently. By the time our company reached its 6th year, we were no longer begging for meetings. The VCs came to us. The CTOs of major corporations started sending their interns to monitor our patent filings. And when our closed demo with Sinclair Holdings went viral among a network of institutional investors, we stopped needing to explain what Juniper did. We became the question mark in every boardroom slide labeled emerging threats. But no one at BarberTech knew it was me. I was still invisible to them, still erased. Until Eli pulled me aside one Tuesday morning, tablet in hand, brow furrowed. "You need to see this," he said, handing it over. It was a press release from BarberTech, light on specifics but full of buzzwords. They were exploring integration with adaptive AI systems and in talks with unnamed startups to modernize their city grid automation division. At the bottom was a stock photo of Max shaking hands with someone blurred out. The caption read, "Leading the charge into AI-driven futures." I didn't say anything at first, just handed the tablet back and stared at the wall for a long moment. I knew that wording, that positioning. They were trying to do what they always did, enter late, buy early, and rename the invention. It wasn't just a PR stunt, it was a threat. Because if BarberTech moved into our space first, they could undercut us before our market debut. Eli leaned against the edge of the desk. "We've got the edge, Celeste, tech ethics function. But they've got distribution." He wasn't wrong. For all our innovation, we were still a small team fighting giants. But giants fall. Not because someone punches harder, but because someone cuts at the right joint. "Let them keep publishing," I said quietly. "They're playing catch-up, and they don't even know who they're chasing." That night, I reviewed the old tech library Dad had shelved 5 years earlier. Back then, I wasn't allowed to touch certain projects. Too risky, too off-brand for their clientele. But I remembered the files. Remembered the automation patents gathering dust in BarberTech's archive. And now, after years of stalling, they were trying to resurrect them ironically to compete with my team. I laughed quietly in the glow of the lab monitor. They were running back to the very ideas they once dismissed, only now they'd have to ask for access. Because months ago, I'd bought those patents quietly under a holding firm. I wasn't trying to trap them. I just knew they'd come crawling eventually. It didn't take long for the first email to arrive. An associate at BarberTech reached out to Juniper Systems Holdings with a vague inquiry about licensing Edge Framework neural code. The phrasing made it obvious they didn't know who they were emailing. I crafted a polite, generic response, delaying the discussion until the following month when we were scheduled to announce a joint project with Sinclair publicly. Timing was everything, and this time it was on my side. The press began to murmur. Tech blogs speculated on the mystery CEO behind Juniper. Rumors flew mostly wrong. Some thought it was a former Google lead. Others swore it was a retired Navy AI engineer. No one guessed the girl who used to sit silently in BarberTech meetings sketching circuits in her margins. That anonymity gave me power, but it also gave me something harder to name: distance. I wasn't angry anymore. Not in the way I had been. There was no fire, no bitterness, just a kind of focused stillness, like the moment before a machine clicks into place. The only one who seemed to sense it was coming was Henry Sinclair. We'd been meeting quietly for months, and on a foggy Wednesday morning he looked across the table at me, fingers steepled, and said, "They're trying to position for a buyout." I didn't respond immediately. Just let the words land. "Do you want them to succeed?" he asked. "Or do you want to teach them what happens when they gamble with the wrong assumptions?" I thought about that for a long time. I wasn't trying to teach anyone a lesson. But I did want one thing: control. Henry leaned back, smiled slowly, and slid a draft across the table. It was a proposed merger agreement. Sinclair would back our acquisition of a controlling stake in BarberTech, under the condition that we retain full product direction and assume strategic leadership. It was bold, risky, impossible, some would say. But possible doesn't move markets. Vision does. I read the draft 3 times before I spoke. We go public with this the night of Victor's event, I said calmly. They won't see it coming. Henry nodded once. It'll hit harder that way. I didn't answer. I was already picturing the look on Max's face when he realized the startup he'd tried to imitate had just bought his seat. A few days later, the official invitation to the birthday gala arrived. Not addressed to me, of course. It came to Henry's office with a note attached from Gwen herself, asking if he'd consider saying a few words during the tribute portion of the evening. Eli raised an eyebrow when he saw it. "You sure you want to do this?" he asked. I took a long breath, folded the card, and placed it inside my coat. Yes, but we're not going for drama. We're going for precision. And this time I wouldn't have to speak loudly. All I had to do was show up. Because when the room sees the ghost they buried, walk in as their new CEO, no one needs to raise their voice. The night of the gala arrived wrapped in the kind of chill only Seattle could deliver in early spring. Cold but not punishing gray, but not dramatic, as if even the sky was holding its breath. I had my hair pulled back in a clean knot, wore a simple black velvet dress, no brand logo visible, and a thin silver band around my wrist, engraved with the coordinates of our first lab. The driver Henry sent didn't ask questions. He didn't need to. The name on the guest list wasn't mine, and the seat reserved at the table near the stage belonged to guest of Sinclair Holdings. The Rosebridge Pavilion stood glowing under soft amber lights, its grand glass doors swinging open as the doormen nodded guests inside. I watched from the back seat for a moment before stepping out, letting the hum of camera shutters and polite laughter greet me like a language I used to understand but no longer spoke. Inside, the atmosphere felt curated to perfection. Classical quartet playing in the corner, waitstaff gliding between tables with practiced timing. And everywhere I looked, polished versions of the same type of people I'd once been told to impress. Industry veterans in charcoal suits, politicians in navy ties, new money in loud shoes. And at the center of it all, my father Victor Barber standing beneath a chandelier shaking hands with a senator. He looked older than I remembered. Or maybe I had just stopped seeing him as invincible. Gwen stood beside him, radiant in emerald silk lips, red voice poised for greeting every camera. Max circled nearby, speaking animatedly, with a local business columnist, grinning as if nothing in the world had ever humbled him. I didn't approach them. I let them feel the weight of my presence before they even knew I was there. I moved toward the check-in table where a young woman with a headset blinked as she looked me up and down. "Name?" she asked, half smiling. "I'm here with Mr. Sinclair," I said calmly. He mentioned my name would be under his list. She hesitated, tapped on her tablet, then froze. Her eyes darted up to me again. "Of course," she said quickly, voice shifting. "Right this way. He just arrived." I followed her through the corridor of tall glass panels, the buzz of voices softening as we reached the private dining zone. Henry stood near a floral arrangement already flanked by 2 venture partners. He turned as I approached, offered no dramatic gesture, just a quiet nod and a subtle grin. "You're right on time," he said simply. "You always are." A waiter handed me a glass of still water as I glanced around. "Has he seen me yet?" I asked. Henry tilted his head slightly. "Not yet, but I think Max just recognized your face from the patent meeting brief. He's pale now. That took less than 5 minutes." I didn't flinch. I had no intention of engaging first. That wasn't the plan. My role tonight wasn't to disrupt. It was to occupy space they thought I'd lost. And when you walk back into a world that erased you, nothing makes a louder sound than saying nothing at all. Dinner was called to the ballroom shortly after. I took my seat between Henry and the COO of a competing robotics firm, both of whom seemed content to watch the tension rise from their plates like steam. My name wasn't on the place card, just a gold monogram, GS Holdings. But I noticed Gwen's glance from across the room. She nudged Max. Max leaned in. Then he stiffened. The MC took the stage 15 minutes later. A crisp introduction. A montage of Victor's achievements over the decades. Photos of ribbon cuttings factory floors, him standing with engineers and mayors and foundation plaques. No photos of me, not even one. I was airbrushed from history so thoroughly it almost became impressive. Then came the tribute speeches. A city official thanked him for bringing automation jobs to the region. A former board chair reminisced about Victor's forward-thinking leadership. Gwen smiled like it was all rehearsed. And Max stepped up, last voice. Confident posture ready. Tonight, we celebrate a man who built not just a company but a future he began. Barber Tech has always stood for legacy. For staying ahead. For innovation. And as we move into the AI space, we are proud to explore new partnerships that carry my father's vision forward. He glanced around the room like he was expecting applause. What he got instead was a hush. A door had just opened behind him, and Henry Sinclair stepped onto the platform. No one had expected him to speak, not yet. But he didn't even reach for the microphone. He looked across the audience, then turned slightly and offered his hand. Not to Max, not to Victor, to me. I believe the person this room truly needs to hear from tonight is someone who understands both legacy and evolution, he said calmly. Celeste, would you join me up here? It wasn't loud, it wasn't dramatic. But it was enough. Enough for every head in the room to turn. Enough for Gwen's glass to tremble slightly in her hand. Enough for Victor to lean forward as if he'd misheard. I tucked my chair back without rush, and walked toward the stage. I didn't wear a name tag. I didn't need one, because when the person they dismissed becomes the one they now need, a favor from introductions are no longer required. I walked toward the stage without rush, my heels soft against the polished floor, every eye in the room following the movement like a slow ripple across still water. No one applauded. No one knew what to do with their hands. And when I stepped beside Henry, I didn't reach for the mic. I just looked out into the sea of stunned faces. The people who once nodded politely as they erased me from meeting invites now frozen in place, as if I had stepped out of a mirror they thought they'd shattered years ago. I nodded once at Henry, who gave a simple smile, then turned to the crowd. Let me clarify something before there's any more confusion, he said calmly. Juniper Systems is not joining Barber Tech. Juniper Systems is acquiring a 58% controlling stake in Barber Tech effective this quarter. The silence that followed wasn't quiet. It had a shape, a weight, the kind that falls when truth cuts clean through reputation. Victor stood slowly from his table. He wasn't angry yet. He was confused. That made it worse. His voice, usually so steady and measured, cracked just slightly as he said, I'm sorry, what exactly are you saying? Henry didn't look away. We've acquired controlling interest in your firm, Victor. And your daughter Celeste is stepping in as co-lead of operations. He didn't need to say CEO. Everyone already knew. Gwen stiffened her smile, fracturing around the edges. Max opened his mouth to object, but no sound came out. I turned slightly to face my father, keeping my posture still. It's nice to see you again, I said evenly. I wasn't planning on speaking tonight, but it felt right to be present considering the future of the company's about to change. The MC stepped aside, uncertain. I walked toward the microphone without waiting for approval. I didn't prepare a speech. I didn't need one. Some of you in this room know me as Victor's daughter, I began. Some of you don't know me at all. That's understandable. It's easy to miss someone when they're being told to sit down quietly for years. There were no gasps, just stillness. What many of you also don't know is that the AI initiative Barber Tech has been attempting to pivot into is based on early models I developed 7 years ago, models that were shelved when leadership deemed them too advanced or too uncertain. I paused just long enough to let that sink in. Since then, I co-founded Juniper Systems, where we spent those years refining what was once dismissed into the very tech Barber Tech now depends on to survive its market downturn. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. We offered a partnership not because we owed it to anyone, but because we believed the work deserved to continue, even if it meant returning to the same boardroom that once laughed at my notes. Victor stepped forward, then not aggressively, just with a kind of haunted hesitation. You were behind Juniper, he said, more to himself than to me. You built that, I nodded. We did. With less funding, less praise, and no shortcuts, I could see the moment it hit him. The memory of the last time we spoke, when he told me to be patient while Max learned. When he told me there would be other chances. Why didn't you ever reach out? he asked softly. Because you weren't listening, I said, not unkindly, and I learned not to repeat myself to people who already decided I had nothing to say. Max finally found his voice. This is a setup. You're just doing this to embarrass us. I turned to him steady. Max, if I wanted to embarrass you, I would have made the internal emails public. The ones where you pitched my 2017 architecture model as your own to investors last year. That stopped him. Henry didn't need to confirm it. Everyone already understood. Gwen clutched her clutch, tighter jaw clenched. You can't just walk in and rewrite everything, she said sharply. This company is Victor's legacy. I let her finish, then said clearly. Then maybe it's time that legacy stopped being afraid of evolution. The line wasn't rehearsed, but it landed. The room began to stir. Some people were clearly angry. Others fascinated. A few started murmuring, looking up press coverage on their phones. I stepped down from the mic and returned to my seat beside Henry, who simply handed me a folder. Inside were the signed merger documents notarized and binding. I glanced across the table. Victor was sitting now, slouched in a way I'd never seen before. Not defeated, but peeled back. Stripped of the image he had polished for years. I looked at him not as a daughter trying to hurt her father, but as a woman who had outgrown being underestimated. And then I spoke quietly, not for the room but for him. The future you ignored has been working without you. And now it's here. He looked at me, really looked, as if finally seeing someone he thought he buried in his past. You did all this, he said. On your own. I nodded once. With a team that believed in the work, not the surname. Behind us the quartet tried to resume playing, but even the music felt hesitant now. As if the melody itself had shifted. As if the rhythm no longer belonged to the legacy, but to the rewrite. The applause didn't come right away, and I didn't expect it to. This wasn't the kind of moment that invited cheers. It was the kind that made people shift in their seats, realizing too late they'd misread the room. As I sat beside Henry, the weight of what had just unfolded began to settle, not as triumph, but as clarity. For years I had imagined what it would feel like to be seen in that room, not as an extra, not as a disappointment, but as someone who mattered. And when it finally happened, it didn't feel like revenge. It felt like release. Victor remained seated, hands laced together, eyes fixed on the tablecloth, as if it held answers he'd ignored for too long. Gwen whispered something to him, her voice low and urgent, but he didn't respond. Max stood off to the side, flustered, trying to salvage a conversation with two investors who now looked bored rather than impressed. I could see him reaching for phrases, growth strategy, competitive edge, multi-channel integration, but none of them landed. The room had moved on without him, and for the first time, he looked like the one trying to catch up. Across the ballroom, the whispers had become waves. I could hear fragments of speculation. She's the founder. Was she always in AI? I thought she left the industry. That was the part I didn't plan for, how fast perception shifts once power changes hands. Suddenly, the narrative was being rewritten in real time, and it didn't come from press releases or interviews. It came from the undeniable fact that the girl they dismissed now held the pen. Henry leaned toward me, his voice low. You handled that better than most seasoned execs. I gave a half smile. I've had a long time to practice what not to say. He nodded, then added. You just moved the market tonight. Not because of a product, because of presence. It was a compliment, but also a warning. Presence attracts attention, and attention brings expectations. I knew what was coming. Press inquiries, partnership pitches, attempts to reframe the story. But I also knew how to hold my ground. I didn't build Juniper to chase headlines. I built it because I knew what it was like to be told I was too early, too complicated, too inconvenient. And I never wanted another mind like mine to be silenced in a boardroom again. A staff member approached Henry to confirm the transportation logistics. As they spoke, I noticed Victor finally rise and make his way toward me. His steps weren't heavy, just careful, like someone trying to approach a place they once locked themselves out of. He stopped a few feet away, not demanding space, but requesting it silently. I met his gaze, saw the layers in it: pride, tangled with regret, shock, softened by something more human. That was quite a performance, he said, but the edge in his voice had dulled. It wasn't a performance, I replied calmly. It was an update. He gave a quiet chuckle, dry, but not mocking. You've grown into something I didn't predict. I let that hang in the air. You weren't supposed to predict me. You were supposed to support me. He nodded slowly, the admission sinking in with more weight than defense could carry. I thought protecting the company meant keeping it familiar, safe, legacy-driven. I looked at him without anger. And in the process, you made innovation feel like a threat. He didn't argue. For once, he just listened. Max approached moments later, trying to wear confidence like a second skin, but it didn't fit. "You blindsided us," he said tightly. "You could have at least warned Dad." I turned toward him unflinching. "I did. 7 years ago. You were in the room when I pitched the prototypes. You called them ambitious sketches." His jaw shifted, but no words followed. I added I wasn't hiding Max. "You were just too certain I had nothing worth watching." Gwen joined us, then arms crossed, eyes sharp. "You think taking over Barber Tech is going to fix the past?" Her tone was part insult, part desperation. I gave a small, measured nod. "It won't fix anything. But it will redirect the future." She opened her mouth again, but Victor raised a hand gently. "Enough, Gwen. This isn't about preserving what we were. It's about accepting what we ignored." He looked at me again, and something in his voice cracked. "Can I still be part of it? Of where this goes next?" The question caught me off guard, not because it was unexpected but because it was sincere. I looked at him not as a daughter looking for validation but as a leader assessing whether someone finally saw the horizon. "That depends," I said quietly. "Are you ready to follow someone you once told to stay silent?" He held my gaze and for the first time nodded without conditions. "Yes, I am." The gala continued around us, music swelling again, conversations shifting toward the open bar and dessert carts, but something unspoken had already shifted. I wasn't there to burn bridges. I was there to rebuild one. I no longer needed to cross, but now had the choice to open. That's the power no one warns you about. Not just being heard, but choosing when and how you respond after years of being silenced. 2 days after the gala, I walked through the revolving glass doors of what was once BarberTech's headquarters, now rebranded with clean, minimal letters, Juniper Barber Systems. The lobby still smelled like cold marble and new carpet, but something about the space felt lighter, like an old tension had finally lifted. The receptionist glanced up, her posture shifting when she saw me, not with fear but with curiosity. I greeted her politely, then passed through security with a temporary badge clipped to my coat. The same security staff who used to glance past me now stood a little straighter as I entered. Not because they feared me, but because they finally recognized that I belonged. The elevator opened on the executive floor with a soft chime. I didn't bring an entourage. No photographers, no press. Just me, a laptop, and the sense that I was finally here for the right reason. The old hallway that once led to my father's office still had the same glass panels, the same abstract art. Gwen had curated to look impressive but hollow. But now the nameplate outside his door had been replaced with mine. I paused for a second, just long enough to let the moment settle, then stepped inside. The space had been cleared, his personal photos boxed, the oversized leather chair removed. Sunlight cut across the desk like a quiet affirmation, and beside it sat a small wrapped package. I didn't need to open it to know who it was from. Inside was a textbook, old and dog-eared, the one my mother gave me before she passed away. It was her copy of Human-Machine Interaction, annotated in tiny ink loops, corners folded with years of use. A sticky note marked a page near the end, and I recognized her handwriting instantly. It read, "For Celeste, who always asked the questions no one wanted to answer. Keep asking." I closed the book, carefully placed it at the center of the desk, and stared at it for a long while. That was the difference between this return and the one I once fantasized about. I didn't need a throne. I just needed the room to think clearly, to lead without apology. That afternoon I met with the engineering and research divisions in a consolidated briefing. Most of them had heard whispers, but few knew the full scope of what had just occurred. I walked in quietly, laptop in hand, and stood at the front of the room as if I'd always been there. I didn't give a speech. I laid out the roadmap. Our shift to AI-driven infrastructure would be swift, precise, and inclusive. Legacy systems would be preserved where necessary, but only as scaffolding. The new direction required new thinking, not louder voices but sharper ones. People listened. Not because I demanded it, but because the silence that followed each of my sentences meant something had changed. I didn't speak like someone selling hope. I spoke like someone who had lived long enough without it. Over the next few days, I began meeting with key department heads. Some were defensive, others cautiously optimistic, but most shared the same undercurrent of relief. They were tired of being told to protect the past at all costs. They wanted to build, and what they needed was not another directive but permission to dream again. I gave it without ceremony, through action more than words. The product team, which had been stagnating for 2 quarters under Max's direction, revived an old AI adaptive grid model I'd prototyped in year 3 at Juniper. They thought it had been shelved. I told them to rerun it with our updated empathy algorithms and gave them a week. They delivered in 3 days. Victor hadn't returned to the office since the night of the gala. I didn't press him. He had lived in this building long enough. Now it was my turn to navigate it differently. Not as a daughter chasing approval, but as a founder anchoring direction. What surprised me most wasn't how quickly people adapted, but how ready they had been to do so. They were just waiting for permission to stop pretending things were working, and sometimes all it takes is for one person to say, "We're going forward," not back. On the 5th day, I received a short message from Victor. "Would you be open to coffee?" I paused before answering, then typed tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. roof garden. The reply came quickly. "I'll be there." That night, as I walked alone through the quiet corridors past the plaques, with outdated slogans past the glass trophy case still filled with awards Max had accepted in my father's name, I didn't feel bitterness. I felt clean air, the kind that comes after years of noise. I was no longer here to correct the past. I was here to lead the future. And this time I wasn't asking for space. I was setting the direction. The rooftop garden was quiet that morning, shrouded in a thin mist that rolled off the glass edges like breath held too long. It was early, just past 9, and the city below hadn't fully woken yet. I sat on a bench near the east side, where the sun usually broke through first, nursing a coffee I barely touched. The air smelled like damp stone, and something soft from the flowers someone still watered regularly. I didn't know if he would show, but I wasn't waiting for closure. I was holding space for whatever came next, whether it arrived gently or not at all. 10 minutes later, the elevator opened with a low chime, and Victor stepped out slowly, wearing a jacket too thin for the weather and a face too tired for denial. He saw me and paused, then made his way over without ceremony. He didn't sit right away, just stood there for a moment, hands in his pockets, like he was trying to decide what version of himself to bring into this conversation. I didn't speak first. I'd learned that silence often says what words can't. Eventually, he took the seat opposite me and let out a long breath. "This is where your mother used to come when the board meetings ran too long," he said quietly. "She said the only way to think clearly was to rise above the noise." I nodded once, remembering the same story. She used to bring me here on weekends, show me which parts of the city the firm's tech had reached, which buildings blinked with systems she helped design. "She would have been proud of you," he added, voice tight around the edges. I looked at him and saw that he meant it. Not as a placation, but as a man trying to step out from behind years of excuses. "You didn't come here to talk about her," I said. "You came to talk about what happens now." He nodded slowly. "I know I don't deserve a seat at this table anymore. And I know the decisions are yours now. But I'd like to help if there's a way to do that, without undoing the work you've built." There was no tremble in his voice, just restraint. The kind that comes from realizing you're no longer the most important voice in the room. I thought for a while before replying. "I'm not here to punish you. This isn't about revenge. But if you want to be part of what we're building now, you'll need to approach it differently. Not with legacy. With humility." He looked down, nodded. "I can do that." I believed him, though, not because he said it, because he showed up without defensiveness, without a script. That meant more than any apology ever could. "Then we start small," I said. "You sit in on the transition meetings. You listen. You learn where the gaps are. You don't try to fix it all. You just understand what's been broken." He smiled faintly. "I can do that too." Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "I read your latest patent filings, the empathy framework. It's elegant, beyond anything I thought possible." For a second, he wasn't my father. He was just an engineer, admiring clean work. That was the closest thing to healing we could ask for. We sat in silence after that, the kind that doesn't demand anything. The kind that lets air pass freely between two people who no longer need to be right to feel understood. He stood first, nodded once, and walked back toward the elevator, leaving behind more than just footprints on the wet stone. Later that day, I stood in the data room reviewing a deployment timeline when Max's name lit up on the internal system. He had submitted a request for a role reassignment, no explanation, no message. Just a formal line of code in the system, asking to be moved out of executive strategy and into development analytics. I read it twice. It wasn't surrender. It was something else. Maybe reflection. Maybe the first step toward being useful instead of loud. I approved it without comment. That evening, as the office lights dimmed and people filed out, Eli passed by my door. He leaned on the frame like he used to back when we worked on folding chairs with no heat. "Big shift," he said. "You ready for the next wave?" I looked up, eyes tired but steady. "We didn't come this far to stay quiet." He grinned and tapped the doorframe once before disappearing down the hall. Alone again, I opened the small drawer to my right and pulled out the folded note my mother once slipped into my old project binder. The ink was faded but legible. "Trust the work. It will carry you through what people won't." She was right. That night, I didn't dream of being seen. I dreamed of building something no one could look away from. Not because it was loud, but because it was true. That's what power becomes when you've earned it through silence. It stops trying to shout, it simply arrives. In the weeks that followed, headlines circulated across every tech publication from coast to coast. Founder of Juniper revealed as daughter of Barber Tech's CEO. AI disruptor restructures legacy empire. The woman who rewrote her family's future. I didn't do any interviews. I declined every podcast invitation, every feature article, every panel that wanted a quote about what it felt like to be underestimated. Because the truth was, I didn't want to become a symbol. I wanted to be left alone to do the work. Publicity would come and go, but real infrastructure, real systemic change took time and quiet discipline. We had technology to scale ethics frameworks, to finalize, and a team now responsible not just for invention, but for transition. That was the part no one glamorizes. The part after the applause. Inside the building, things began to shift naturally. Gwen stepped down from her advisory role 3 days after Victor's quiet return to the boardroom. There was no argument, no press release, just a short internal memo and a bouquet of white tulips left on her desk by an assistant who didn't even know her favorite flower. Max kept to his lane in the data division, rarely making eye contact in the halls, but no longer faking importance in strategy meetings. I noticed him lingering a few extra minutes after product reviews, listening more than speaking, and occasionally leaving behind notes with useful observations. He wasn't trying to be a star anymore. He was trying to contribute. That in itself was progress. Victor re-entered slowly, always with a notebook, never with a speech. He sat in on meetings, asked careful questions, and never once interrupted a junior engineer mid-sentence. Some of them didn't recognize him, which he seemed to prefer. In private, we talked occasionally, not about the past, but about code, about philosophy, about the future of intelligent systems, and how we would keep them human. The more he listened, the more I saw the man my mother once loved, the version of him who stayed up late debugging her simulations, who sketched solutions in napkins, who never needed to be the loudest to be the most effective. That version had been buried for too long under boardroom politics and legacy pressure. Now it was resurfacing. And he looked lighter for it. One morning, Eli walked into my office, holding a prototype casing. It was sleek, efficient, elegant. The outer shell of the Juniper home node designed to scale our AI interface into public utilities. He placed it on my desk, didn't say anything at first. Then he smiled. "It's ready. Pilot cities are lined up. We're 3 weeks ahead of the forecast." I held the object in my hand, felt the subtle pulse of possibility humming beneath the surface. We had built something resilient. Not just technically but culturally, a system that could grow because it wasn't bound by ego. I looked up at him. "You think they're ready?" He nodded. "More than they know." That afternoon, I stood in the West Conference Room, overlooking the city, the skyline reflecting off the glass, like a reminder that everything eventually reshapes itself. One of the interns walked past and paused. She looked nervous, like she wasn't sure if she should say something. Then she stepped forward. I just wanted to say thank you, she said quickly, for showing that you don't have to raise your voice to make space. I smiled, nodded once, and told her the truth. Sometimes, silence is the loudest strategy. At the end of that week, I walked back into the same hall where I once presented ideas that were ignored. This time, I wasn't pitching, I was listening. My team led the session. I sat in the second row scribbling thoughts, letting them direct the energy. No one asked me for permission, they just moved forward. I had become what I always wanted, someone who made space for others to rise without asking them to trade their voice for access. The final slide of the presentation read, "Future-proof is human-centered." It wasn't my phrase. It came from a developer who had been overlooked in his previous role, but was now leading a design team. I stayed after to shake his hand. "That's the most important line I've read in months," I said. He beamed. Not because I'd praised him, but because he knew it was true. That night, as I walked alone through the empty building past the data labs and AI testing floors, past rooms once filled with silence that now hummed with purpose, I paused at the glass lobby doors. The city lights blinked below, alive with motion and chance. I pressed my palm against the cool glass, not searching for reflection but anchoring in the moment. I wasn't the same woman who walked away years ago. I wasn't the ghost they thought they buried. I was here, and I was staying. Not for revenge. Not for applause. But for the simple radical act of shaping something better than what came before. Months passed not in silence but in steady motion. We expanded into 3 new states, launched the pilot program for city-integrated empathy nodes, and began drafting educational partnerships to reframe how AI is taught in public schools. I stopped keeping track of press mentions, not because they didn't matter, but because they stopped defining what we did. The attention had come, then softened, then matured into something more sustainable: respect. Not fear, not novelty, not buzz, just earned consistent respect. And that, in this industry, was harder to build than any machine. I kept my schedule lean, refused to attend panels unless I could speak about systems, not identity. I stopped talking about the story everyone wanted to label. It wasn't a redemption arc, it wasn't revenge. It was survival, and then it became direction. Most of the world still didn't know the specifics: how I sat alone in server rooms, while others took credit; how I learned to measure my worth by lines of code instead of applause. That was fine. It didn't need to be published to be real. The only thing that mattered was what happened next. Victor now occupied a small office on the 6th floor. It wasn't symbolic. He asked for it himself. Said he wanted a space without windows, somewhere he could focus. Once a week we met for 20 minutes. No agendas, no drama. We talked like 2 people who finally spoke the same language again. He showed me old notes from projects I never knew existed. I showed him designs that had once lived only in my head. We didn't call it healing, we just called it work. Max eventually left quietly. He didn't storm out. He didn't leave a resignation letter on my desk. One morning, HR forwarded his exit notice, and that was it. I found a small envelope in my inbox the next day, with a note that simply said, "You were right. I wasn't listening. No apology, just acknowledgement." I didn't reply. Some things don't need a reply to be understood. And I hoped wherever he landed next he'd carry that sentence with him as something more than guilt. Maybe growth. On the anniversary of our first successful prototype, Eli brought out a bottle of cheap champagne we'd hidden behind the old server tower at the original lab. It was warm, poorly stored, and tasted slightly metallic. We drank it anyway, because we'd earned it. Because sometimes the most expensive thing you own is the belief that you were never meant to make it this far, and yet somehow you did. The team stayed late that night, not because they had to, but because no one wanted to be the first to leave. I stood by the window watching them laugh, sketch ideas on the whiteboards, argue over user flow patterns like it meant the world. And maybe it did. Because purpose doesn't always roar. Sometimes it sounds like people who no longer fear being ignored. Before I left that night, I walked through the lobby again. The glass doors reflected a different version of me now. Not softer, not sharper, just clearer. There was no plaque commemorating what we'd done. No statue, no tribute video. Just a hallway that used to carry footsteps that doubted me now, echoing back in quiet support. That was more than enough. Later back home, I reread the notebook my mother left behind. Not for comfort. Just for clarity. On the last page, she had scribbled something I hadn't noticed before, written in faint pencil, like a thought she wasn't sure would ever be read. Let the world underestimate you. Just make sure they're still watching when you prove them wrong. I didn't cry. I didn't need to. That sentence had already lived in my bones for years. Now it simply had a name. So if you've ever found yourself erased in a room you helped build, silenced at a table you set, or dismissed by people who used to praise your obedience more than your vision, I hope you know this. You are not invisible. You are simply unannounced. And sometimes the loudest thing you can do is keep building anyway. Because one day the people who overlooked you will have to sit quietly while the room turns to face you. Not because you demanded it, but because you earned it. And I wonder, have you ever been told you weren't ready, only to realize you were never meant to ask for permission in the first place?